Every year, millions of people push their bodies to the absolute limit to run 42 kilometers. The word itself, marathon, is born from a blood-soaked memory over 2,500 years old. Legend holds that a single messenger ran from a windswept beach to deliver a message of triumph and paid for those words with his very last breath. But behind that legendary run lies a much darker, more desperate tactical reality. In 490 BC, a small, isolated Athenian army stood alone against the largest empire the world had ever seen. Why did the mighty Persian fleet choose to land on this specific narrow plain? How did a young democracy find the courage to march out and face certain annihilation? The Athenian general Miltiades saw a fleeting tactical opening on the field, but using it meant risking everything. And even if they could win on the plain, why was victory itself not enough to save their city from destruction? But before the run could begin, the battlefield of Marathon had to be survived. The Persian Empire was the largest dominion the world had ever seen. But when the young Athenian democracy supported a rebellion in Ionia and helped burn the city of Sardis, they earned the lasting enmity of King Darius I. Furious, Darius shot an arrow toward the heavens, praying to Zeus for vengeance. He ordered a servant to repeat 3 times before dinner every single day, "Master, remember the Athenians." In the summer of 490 BC, that fury arrived on the Greek coast. A Persian fleet of 600 ships carried an elite force across the Aegean Sea, commanded by Datis and Artaphernes. Their mission was absolute: reduce Athens and Eretria to slavery and drag them before the king. Eretria fell in just 3 days, its temples burned and its citizens bound in heavy iron chains. Athens stood next in the line of fire. In panic, Athens dispatched their fastest courier to Sparta to plead for aid. But the Spartans refused to march immediately, bound by their sacred law during the Carneia festival. Athens was left almost completely alone. Inside the Athenian War Council, a political crisis exploded. The 10 generals were split evenly. 5 wished to stay and defend the city walls, while 5 wished to march out and fight. The tie-breaking vote fell to Callimachus, the polemarch. The general Miltiades stepped forward, warning that waiting would allow traitors to surrender the city. Miltiades pleaded, "With thee now it rests, Callimachus, either to bring Athens under slavery or by making her free to leave behind a memorial for all time." Persuaded, Callimachus cast his vote to fight. The Athenians, joined by a small force of 1,000 Plataeans, marched to the plain of Marathon. They successfully blocked the 2 exits, pinning the Persian host against the sea. But the Persian numerical advantage would only matter if they could deploy it on the field, and Marathon was not a normal battlefield. Across the narrow plain of Marathon, 2 completely different military philosophies stared at each other. This was not just a clash of men, but a collision between 2 entirely different ways of war. On one side was the military machine of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persians relied on speed, flexibility, and devastating ranged power. Their decisive arm was the cavalry, elite noble horsemen who could shower an enemy with javelins and arrows while staying safely out of reach. On foot, thousands of Persian infantrymen carried powerful composite bows and short spears. They wore colorful fabric tunics, trousers, and soft felt caps, carrying light shields made of woven wicker. This light equipment made them exceptionally fast and agile in open terrain, but it left them terribly exposed. In a direct, close-quarters melee, their wicker shields and fabric armor offered almost no protection against heavy steel and bronze. On the other side stood the citizen soldiers of Athens, the hoplites. They did not fight as individual warriors, but as a single, massive entity known as the phalanx. The hoplite was a heavy bronze fortress. A Corinthian-style bronze helmet forged from a single sheet protected his head, while heavy plate armor shielded his limbs. In his left arm, he locked the aspis, a massive bronze-faced wooden spear designed to overlap with the man next to him, creating an unbroken wall of metal. And protruding from this shield wall was the doru, a heavy thrusting spear up to 10 feet long. The phalanx was nearly impenetrable from the front, possessing unmatched crushing power in a direct collision. But this heavy armor came with a dangerous price. The Athenians were slow and easily exhausted. If their flanks were turned, or if their tight formation fractured, they would be cut to pieces by the highly mobile Persians. Worse, they had no cavalry and no archers. If they remained stationary under the blistering hail of Persian arrows, they would be systematically destroyed before ever reaching the enemy. This was a deadly paradox. To win, the Persians had to keep the Greeks at a distance and use their superior mobility to swarm the slow-moving phalanx. To survive, the Athenians had to close the gap and force the lightly armored invaders into a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. The strategic problem facing the Athenian command was monumental. Miltiades could not turn hoplites into cavalry, nor could he turn Athens into an empire. But he could choose where and how the battle would be fought.
Of Mount Agrialiki and the Aegean Sea. To the north lay a treacherous, unforgiving salt marsh, a natural barrier that restricted any sudden flanking maneuvers. For 5 agonizing days, the two armies stood in a tense, silent stalemate. The Athenians held the high ground near the mountain spurs, effectively blocking the narrow exits that led directly inland. But the Greek commanders knew they were running out of time. By marching their entire active army to the coast, they had left the city of Athens completely denuded of defenders. Then, the Thambau brought a terrifying piece of tactical intelligence. The Persian commanders, Dates and Artaphernes, had decided to break the deadlock. Under the cover of darkness, they began the time-consuming process of re-embarking their elite, deadly cavalry back onto their transport ships. Their strategic plan was devastatingly simple: to sail around Cape Sunion and launch a secondary attack directly on the undefended rear of Athens. But as the horses were being loaded onto the ships, a secret signal came from the Persian camp. Pro-Greek Ionian soldiers climbed into the trees, waving a desperate warning to the Athenian lines. "Chorus hippies, the cavalry is away." Miltiades recognized this was his only tactical window to strike. Without the threat of a devastating Persian cavalry charge, the heavy Greek phalanx finally had a fighting chance. But to cross the 1,500-meter plain, Miltiades had to solve a final, deadly mathematical problem. The Persian army was vastly superior in numbers, and their battle line was far wider than his own. If he kept the standard 8-man depth of the phalanx, the Persians would easily overlap his flanks and encircle his entire force. So Miltiades made a monumental, highly risky gamble. He ordered the center of his formation, led by the Leontes and Antiochus tribes under Themistocles and Aristides, to be thinned to just 4 ranks deep. But on the wings, he kept the formation heavily reinforced at a full 8 ranks deep. He would stretch his army to match the exact width of the Persian line, accepting an incredibly fragile center to secure his flanks. This was not a guaranteed masterstroke. If the thin center broke too quickly before the wings could win their fights, the entire Athenian army would be sliced in two. Miltiades had placed the weakest part of his line directly in front of the enemy's main strength. When dawn broke, he would have to prove it was a trap, not a fatal mistake.
The distance between the two armies narrowed to 8 stadia, just under 1 mile. Miltiades looked across the plain, raised his hand, and gave the final order. At them. Down from the mountain slopes, the Athenian and Plataean phalanx began their steady advance. For the first 1,000 meters, the Greeks marched in strict, silent coordination, keeping their heavy shield wall intact. But as they crossed into the beaten zone, the 200-meter mark, where Persian arrows became deadly, the command was given to run.
heavily armed hoplites broke into a rapid, disciplined jog to minimize their exposure to the incoming fire. To the Persians, this sight was sheer madness. They watched a smaller force charging towards them at a run, with absolutely no cavalry or archers to support them. But the surprise in the Persian camp turned to terror as the massive wall of bronze and wood closed the gap. With a deafening roar, the two armies collided. Heavy wooden auspice shields slammed into the light wicker shields of the Persian infantry, shaling the front lines with tremendous force. The tactical advantage of Greek bronze plate armor and 8-foot spears immediately began to tell in the close-quarters melee. But in the center of the battlefield, the plan of Miltiades faced its ultimate test. Here, the Persians had deployed their finest, most elite troops, including the fierce Saka warriors. Against this formidable force, the thin Athenian center, only 4 ranks deep, began to buckle under the immense pressure. The Athenian center fractured and began to retreat inland. Believing the Athenian army was collapsing, the Persians let out a victory cry and surged forward, pursuing the retreating Greeks deep into the plain. But this was exactly what Miltiades had anticipated. On the wings, the heavily reinforced Greek formations, 8 ranks deep, easily shattered the inferior Persian levies. But instead of pursuing the enemy fleeing, the victorious Greek wings did something extraordinary. They stopped. They turned inward, wheeling their massive formations to face the exposed flanks of the advancing Persian center. The deadly trap closed. The elite Persian center was suddenly encircled on 3 sides, compressed into a chaotic, suffocating mass of men. In this tight hand-to-hand struggle, their composite bows were useless and their short spears could not penetrate the bronze phalanx. Panic spread through the Persian ranks like wildfire. The orderly Persian line completely broke, turning into a frantic, desperate stampede towards the sea. Many of the fleeing invaders, unfamiliar with the terrain, ran directly into the deep, treacherous northern salt marshes, where hundreds drowned in the mud. The Persians had lost the battlefield, but their fleet was still intact, and behind the Athenian army was a city left completely undefended. The battle on the plain was won, but the violence now spilled onto the blood-stained shoreline. The Athenians pursued the fleeing Persians directly into the surf, desperate to capture their fleet. A brutal struggle erupted around the ships as the invaders fought to push off into the open sea. In the chaos, Cynaegeirus, the brother of the playwright Aeschylus, grabbed a Persian warship with his bare hand, only for a crewman to sever it with an axe, killing him. The Athenians managed to capture 7 ships. But the remaining fleet successfully launched, sailing rapidly toward the open sea. As Miltiades watched the ships disappear, his triumph turned to immediate dread. The Persian fleet was not retreating to Asia. They were sailing directly around Cape Sunion, heading straight for Athens. With the entire Athenian army miles away at Marathon, the city was left completely undefended. Worse, pro-Persian traders inside the city walls were waiting to open the gates to the exiled tyrant Hippias. The victory on the plain would mean absolutely nothing if Athens fell before the army could return. The exhausted, battle-weary hoplites had no time to rest. They immediately turned back and began a grueling, high-paced march of 40 kilometers back to their city. In the popular legend that became inseparable from Marathon, a single messenger named Phidippides ran this distance ahead of the army, collapsing and dying after declaring victory. But historical sources suggest a different reality. The earliest account by Herodotus, who wrote just decades after the battle, mentions no such post-battle run. Instead, Phidippides' true feat took place before the battle, when he ran over 220 kilometers to Sparta in less than 2 days to beg for help. The story of the dying messenger was likely a romantic invention, created 5 centuries later by writers like Plutarch and Lucian. The true endurance test belonged to the entire Athenian army. Marching under the blistering heat in heavy bronze armor, they raced against the sails on the horizon. They arrived back in Athens in the late afternoon, successfully lining up on the heights of Synerges just as the Persian ships anchored off the coast. seeing the very same army they had fought at Marathon waiting for them. The Persians, demoralized, turned their ships around and sailed back to Asia. Marathon had saved Athens on that fateful day, but the true significance of the victory would only be seen in the decades that followed.
The defeat at Marathon barely touched the vast resources of the Persian Empire. To great King Darius I, the loss of over 6,000 men was merely a minor border setback. Doubly infuriated by the news, Darius immediately began raising a colossal new army to completely subjugate Greece. The war between the Greek city-states and Persia was far from over. Yet, Marathon changed the psychological balance of the ancient world forever. For the first time, the myth of Persian invincibility was completely shattered. It proved to the Greeks that resistance, rather than submission, was possible. This victory endowed a young Athenian democracy with an enduring faith in its destiny, paving the way for its golden age. More practically, the victory bought Greece 10 invaluable years of preparation. During this precious decade, the statesman Themistocles convinced the citizens to use silver from the newly discovered mines of Larion to build a massive fleet of triremes. It was this very navy that would decide the fate of the war at the Battle of Salamis 10 years later. Without the extra time won on the sands of Marathon, that fleet would never have existed. Centuries later, this decisive clash was memorialized through a legendary long-distance run. When the modern Olympic Games were established in Athens in 1896, organizers created a marathon event to honor the ancient messenger. But the standardized distance of 42.195 kilometers was not born in Greece. It was established in 1908 for the Olympic Games in London. The Athenians did not win because they were stronger in every way. They won because they chose a battlefield that restricted the enemy's mobility. They understood their tactical strengths and weaknesses. They maintained absolute discipline under a rain of arrows. And they accepted a risky battle plan executed at the exact right second. Today, millions of people run a marathon as the ultimate test of human endurance. But this distance was born from the memory of a day when endurance did not just belong to a single messenger, but to an entire army. The men of Athens who held the line, bore the pressure, and turned an unfavorable beach into the place where an empire was forced to retreat. At Marathon, Athens did not defeat Persia by matching the empire's strength. It won by making that strength impossible to use.